So there's three things I'm sending around. Oh. So there's an elaborate and treasure-filled website, the course web site. Any of you who aren't, I don't know, in the ordinary PIT system are liable to have trouble getting into that website. I mean, there is a facility for visitors, but it doesn't work very well. So if you will email Yao Fan and ask him to give you access to the Dropbox version of that material, then you can get into it without having to mess with the course web version of it. For those of you who can get into the course web version, it's a little bit more elaborate, but we're going to make sure that all the material that's in it is in the Dropbox. There. So in particular, all these things I've distributed here are, but also all the Sellars materials, there's PDFs of all the books, all the articles, including some unpublished stuff that's from the archive that we want to look at. There's a little bit of some of my favorite photographs of Sellars are in there for just sort of staring at the great man. So I recommend that you look at that. I want to do 4 things today by way of introduction. And the first involves this set of Sellars quotes that I've distributed. I want to pretty much plunge right in and hear from the great man. Then I want to back up and talk about Kant a little bit. That's Sellars' muse. His principal claim to fame is what he made of Kant, and I want to get that background out for us. Third thing then is to say at least a few words about the intervening period, sort of neo-Kantianism between Kant and Sellars, just to place him in historical space. And then the fourth thing I want to do is talk about his corpus, his life, his intellectual development, and where the things that we're going to read this semester fit into that development and into that corpus. So, I was going to say, it goes without saying that I think Sellars is a great philosopher, but I believe in making things explicit. I believe Sellars is a great philosopher. From where I sit, he's the most important American philosopher since Charles Sanders Peirce. The very recent ones, it's hard to say. My teachers, Kripke, David Lewis. It's a little bit too early to be placing them in that kind of space, but at least up to his generation, I want to defend the claim that he was the greatest philosopher and most important American thinker during this period. When I think about greatness in a philosopher, about great-making features of a philosopher, I think of two things. One is they have to have taught us great, big, important, potentially transforming lessons. They have to, in some sense, have made all things new, so that if you learn their lessons, you think about central philosophical issues in a different way than was available before you learned those lessons. That's something like them being deep in a sense of radical, going to the roots, digging down and making you think differently about fundamental issues. That doesn't necessarily coincide with being philosophically influential or being in the canon. But I think it does distinguish some canonical philosophers, Descartes and Spinoza, as opposed to Malebranche, for instance, who was a smart guy, had lots to say. I don't see the transformative ideas there that I do in the other figures. The second thing I mean when I talk about the greatness of a philosopher is the richness of their work, its inexhaustibility, the fact that however carefully you read what they wrote, however long you work on it, every time you go to it, you find something new and valuable in it, that you never have the sense of having plumbed all the depths and gotten to the bottom of it. And here, Paradigm talk about anyone who spent their entire life reading Kant, and they will tell you, I think, every time they read one of these works, they find new stuff in it, new philosophical insights and ideas. And along these two dimensions, I think Sellars is a great philosopher in a way that puts him in a different class than others of his generation who might be thought of as rivals. Quine, for instance, who was a much more influential and celebrated philosopher, essentially of exactly the same vintage as Sellars, and someone I have a great deal of respect for and have learned a lot from, but I don't see on these two dimensions that he's in a class with Sellars. But saying that is cheap, let's actually look at some of the things that Sellars says. What you find on this sheet is 18 quotes. All of them are drawn from things that we'll read during this term. They don't cover the whole gamut of topics that he addresses in the things that we'll read. I focused a little bit in picking these quotes, but it is one of the central collections of themes and topics that he addresses that is represented here. And I want to suggest that as you read these, I'm going to go through them seriatim and just say a few words about each of them, but as you read them, one thing you can think about is this is a list of 18 possible paper topics. That is, any one of these quotes, I think, is something that it would be worth first trying to figure out exactly what the claim is that's being made. Situating it relative to various things that you could mean by saying things like this. What exactly is he saying here? And that involves more than just staring at the words on the page, though that too, but thinking about the surround. Where does it come in the text? What other things does he say? And so on. And then thinking about, is this right? Thinking critically about it. What reasons could you give for making the usually pretty big claim that he's making here? What would the objections to it be? How would you adjudicate and assess this claim? And then third, depending on how your adjudication comes out, what are the consequences of that? If he's right, what else do we have to think about differently because of this claim? And if he's not right, what else do we think about differently? What can we learn from this claim. You'll see there's a lot of overlapping strands just in these quotes, so one might want to sort of look over your shoulder at one of the other quotes, or even two of them. Trying to get all of them in one synoptic vision is a great big job. I wouldn't recommend it for a term paper, but looking at one in the light of some of the others, that's another thing one might do. So I'm not saying this is the only thing, the only way one might approach picking something to write about, but this is just sort of as you read them here, you can think about which ones it would be worth thinking about more and getting clearer about. These first two passages are famous in the Sellars lore. They both come from his masterwork, Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind. And I should say I've titled this collection Describing, Explaining, and Justifying. And those are three topics that come up again and again in here. Normativity comes up as well, modality, but really focusing on these notions is helpful, I think, in going through these. So the first is a passage that's come to be known as the Scientia Mensura passage. In the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things. Of what is, that it is, and what is not, and of what is not, that it is not. So obviously this is a pastiche of Protagoras, but science is the measure of all things. But that opening qualification is really important. In the dimension of describing and explaining, there's a implicit suggestion that that isn't everything. That qualification is doing some work there. And one would like to know, well, what work is it? What work is it doing? What's the scope and significance of that opening qualification? And then, even with that qualification, is the rest of it right? Is science the measure of all things in that domain? Second, famous passage from APM, in characterizing an episode or a state as that of knowing, we're not giving an empirical description of that state or episode. We're placing it in the logical space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Now, I mentioned parenthetically, we're in the Wilfrid Sellars seminar room, informally known as the space of reasons, invoked here in this passage. In characterizing a state as one of knowing, we aren't describing it. We're doing something else. We're putting it in the space of reasons, placing it as the kind of thing that issues of justification arise for. So you can see here the beginning of a response to the question, what's the scope of the qualification in the Scientia Mensura passage? Among the things that are not describing and explaining is saying that something is a bit of knowledge, that someone knows something. That's doing something else than describing and explaining. What this thing is, placing it in the space of reasons, in the space of justification, well, that remains to be seen. One of the reasons that these two passages, particularly paired, loom so large in the literature about Sellars is the Rorty used them to characterize the division among readers of Sellars into left-wing and right-wing Sellarsians. The ones who find the most philosophical illumination in the Scantia Mensura passage were what he called right-wing Sellarsians. The ones who find the greatest philosophical illumination in the second passage, he called left-wing Sellarsians. And there's a lot of truth to this division. There really are 41ers and 36ers here. Among prominent right-wing Sellarsians, Ruth Millikan, his last Yale PhD student, the Churchlands, Jay Rosenberg, one of his most thoughtful commentators, is a right-wing Sellarsian. Rorty is a very prominent left-wing Sellarsian, and I would have to count myself on that side as well. Sellars himself thought these were just two fundamental claims that he made. One can think here of the Vienna Circle, which had two wings, a naturalist wing that said, really the important thing is that the world we're philosophizing about is the natural world as science tells us about it. And Otto Neurath, it was the arch naturalist. And there was an empiricist wing that said, no, what's really important is the method of empirical knowledge, the method of science, learning from experience as opposed to some kind of a priori theorizing. And Moritz Schlick was the head of the empiricist wing. And the naturalism and the empiricism were in a certain sort of tension with one another. For instance, empiricists downstream from Hume had real problems making sense of modal statements, of the difference between universal regularities and law-like statements. But to the naturalists, what science tells us is about laws of nature. But those are very hard to make sense of in empiricist terms. Quine, in the later generation, had a tension between his naturalism and his empiricism in this regard. Poor Carnap was in the middle, trying to keep these two wings from flying off separately, keep them together in one movement. Well, Sellars is sort of the Carnap of the Sellarsians here. And Rorty, in characteristic fashion, expressed his hope and his confidence that the left-wing and right-wing Sellarsians would sort their differences out in the end more irenically, more peacefully than the right-wing and left-wing Hegelians did, who, as Rorty put it, settled their differences once and for all at a 6-month-long seminar called the Battle of Stalingrad. And I'm happy to say that so far, the Sellarsians have been able to engage in more properly seminar-like behavior than the right-wing and left-wing Hegelians. At any rate, there's enough truth to this division of admirers of Sellars into those for whom the Scantia Mensura is at the center, and those for whom the insight we left-wing Sellarsians will say that in calling something a knowing, one is not describing it, but doing something else, taking up a different kind of stance towards it. One obvious question about that 36 passage is, what's the range of substituents that he would allow for knowing in it? How much turns on him saying that that's knowing? For instance, does the factiveness of knowing matter? The fact that knowings are true, is that the essential thing? Or does he also think that in saying, in characterizing some state as a state of believing, that one is not empirically describing it? Spoiler alert, yes, believing could go in just as well as knowing. In a way, it's distracting that he, from his point, that he says, knowing here. Okay, well, I haven't said very much about this. I'm not going to say very much about any of these, just enough to try and give some sense of the richness of the claims that are being made here, the importance of them. And I put these two first, not just because of the sort of sociological significance of them, but because it was, in no small part, the challenge of Sellars' own thought to get these two together, to entitle himself to say both of them and to say how they interacted with one another. Another passage, 3. It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all rather than merely label. So obviously we have a distinction here between mere labeling and describing. Describing, that's what science is the measure of all things. But we already saw there's a contrast sort of at the other end, beyond describing, placing in a space of justification is something beyond describing. Now this passage is telling us something about this notion of describing. It's more than, well, what is labeling? More than merely classifying things. And here the implicit reference is to the traditional logic, the scholastic logic refracted through the Port Royal logicians as it came down to Kant, as Kant inherited it already, that was in 3 levels, each of which was thought about, or anyway, the relations between which were thought about in terms of classification. So logic, semantics, started with a doctrine of concepts, divided into particular and general concepts, and on that basis built a doctrine of judgments, different kinds of judgments, depending on whether one was classifying something particular as something general, or saying that one general concept fell under another general concept. And then built on that doctrine of judgments, thought of as kinds of classification, classified according to the kind of classification that each one of them involved, a doctrine of consequences or syllogisms that classified inferences depending on what kind of classifications the judgments were. Celarent and Barbara, remember all of these syllogistic terms. The vowels referred to the kind of classification, the kind of judgments that were involved in them. The classical logic tried to do everything with the notion of classification. And Sellars is saying, inter alia here, that's not good enough. That's not a rich enough concept to get you yet to descriptions. For descriptions, you're going to need something more than the mere labeling that these concepts thought of as classifiers are. Now we'll see him fill this in a little bit in a later passage. But he's at least raising the issue, well, what is description? And I want to point out these notions, describing, explaining, justifying, he's taking these pretty much as they come. That is, he's not starting with a philosophically, theoretically elaborated notion. We're not going to hear anything about propositions, about even fact-stating discourse, not about representation. All those sorts of things can come in on down the line, but when we're thinking about these philosophical phenomena, thinking philosophically about these phenomena, he wants to do so in as neutral and close to the practice as possible. Okay, here's another index claim, passage 4. Although describing and explaining are distinguishable, they're also, in an important sense, inseparable. The descriptive and explanatory resources of language advance hand in hand. Now, this is a very rich and pregnant passage. On the face of it, I would say these kinds of discursive activity, describing and explaining. I mean, he throws in some others in the parentheses, and at some point we'd have to worry about those. One can be describing in a particular act and not be explaining, or vice versa. Doing those is doing different things, and one may be only doing one of them at a time. But globally, they're only intelligible in terms of their relation to each other. The claim in the vicinity here, the one that really matters, is you couldn't have a language that involved one of them and not the other, a language in use. There isn't an autonomous discursive practice, a language game you could play, though you played no other, that consists only of describing or only of explaining. And you might suspect that the reason for that is that in order to be describing, you have to place things in a space of implications, and that has something to do with the involvement of explaining. Now he says, in passage 5, to make first-hand use of modal expressions, subjunctive conditionals, things that say, if this were to happen, this would happen. If this had happened, this other thing would have happened. That's his paradigm of modal expressions, is subjunctive conditionals. In the essay that this comes from, CDCM is counterfactuals, dispositions, and the causal modalities. He's principally concerned with subjunctive conditionals. I should say, parenthetically, one of the things you'll find in the course website or in the Dropbox is, and it may even actually be on the syllabus, is the URL of the canonical bibliography of Sellars. And that bibliography gives letter abbreviations for all the things that he wrote. And these are, in the Sellars business, completely canonical. So Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind is EPM. This Counterfactualist Dispositions and the Causal Modalities is CDCM. And at least the big ones you'll quickly come to recognize. But that's a real resource. And let me point out, because it's not screamingly obvious on it, when you go to that website, that there's a button at the top that will let you sort them chronologically rather than alphabetically. It's easier to find them alphabetically, but for our purposes, the chronological listing of them is much more important. Okay, that's all hanging on my saying this was from CDCM. To make first-hand use of these modal expressions, counterfactual condition, counterfactually robust, counterfactual supporting subjunctive conditionals, is to be about the business of explaining a state of affairs or justifying an assertion. Now, here he's telling us about explanation and justification, explaining and justifying, and notice that they take different kinds of objects. You explain a state of affairs, that's something out in the world. I explain why the window shattered, but you justify an assertion. Now, to call something an assertion isn't to describe it, it's to place it in the space of justification, of justifying. I say you should sort of be seeing strands going back and forth through these passages, but I picked this because it seems to me there's important clues about how he's using these expressions, how he's thinking about things here. Sixth passage. Once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse are not inferior, they're just different. So there's a tautology. The world is described, later on we'll see him wanting to say, is completely describable anyway, using descriptive concepts. But that's not the only kind of concept. There's other important jobs that concepts can do. And there's a temptation, which he sees empiricism, both classical British empiricism and contemporary to him, Vienna Circle, logical empiricism, in assimilating all expressions to descriptive expressions and saying that anything that isn't intelligible as describing the natural world is defective. It's bad metaphysics, or merely expressing an affect, or something like that. One of Sellars' targets is going to be what he calls descriptivism, which is, it's a house with many mansions, but at the center of it is the idea that the job of linguistic expressions is to describe. A paradigm descriptivist tract is the Tractatus. And at the same time, for Sellars, the breakthrough that Wittgenstein made in the Tractatus, the key insight that he had there was, yeah, but not all expressions have descriptive roles. In particular, what made the Tractatus work was his realization that logical expressions don't describe how things are. They play a different role. And Sellars is going to think, yeah, well, that's right, you got that far, but now you need to think about other things, that other jobs that expressions might play. The later Wittgenstein, of course, recoils as far as it's possible to recoil from descriptivism, and sees language as a cornucopia of expressive roles, unsurveyably rich in all the different things you can do with the language besides just describing. That's the principal criticism he has of his earlier view, was this Procrustean forcing of everything into the descriptive mold. Well, he saw well enough to see that logical expressions didn't belong there, which his earlier logical atomist self and Russell didn't see. They were looking for negative facts and conditional facts and looking for the feature of the world that distinguished negative facts from positive facts. And it was a brilliant breakthrough in the Tractatus to see, no, you didn't need to find some bit of reality that was represented or described by the negation sign in order to understand its role in, well, describing. But this is a very rich passage. Once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe all non-logical concepts, because we've already taken on board the Tractarian lesson that logical concepts don't have that. But the Vienna Circle had not yet made this move. The way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists had relegated to second-class citizenship are not inferior, they're just different. And we can expect to hear more from him about what they are. Let me pause here for a second to mention that he sometimes uses the Latinate forms description, explanation, justification here. Early on in EPM, he describes words like this, and crucially, experience is a word like this, as suffering from what he calls the notorious ing-ed ambiguity. In this case, between describing and what's described or describable. Between, if we have to have a theory, if we have to use theoretical terms for it, an act and a content. And a host of philosophically central concepts, like justification, have this ambiguity. You can use justification to talk about the act, activity, process, or practice of justifying something. Or you can use it to talk about the status of being justified, having a positive justificatory status, as we might say. And it's absolutely crucial to think about the difference between those so that you can raise questions about the relations between them. I'm going to give an example, and it's going to be extremely telegraphic. If it helps, it helps, and if it doesn't, don't worry about it. The Agrippan trilemma in epistemology, in thinking about justification, so-called because Agrippa, for all I know, first came up with this. The trilemma, either justification must go on forever. When we ask, well, what justifies this claim? What justifies P? Well, Q is a premise that justifies it. What justifies that? It goes on forever. Or it goes in a circle, you come back around, or there's some unjustified justifier, some foundation that it ends up in. Familiar situation, even if calling it the Agrippan trilemma, not so common. That turns on running together the notion of justifying and justificatory status, what's justified or justifiable. And the tradition in epistemology coming out of the later Wittgenstein, maybe O.K. Bousma is the first sort of prominent person to argue this. If you have what we might call a default and challenge structure of justification, where things can be justified, have positive justificatory status, without having to have been justified. So that's a default. They can be challenged and lose that justificatory status, but some kinds of claims, maybe sincere first-person reports of visible objects, come with a default justificatory status that they don't inherit from having been justified by something else. Well, then things look very different. You're not stuck in the Agrippan trilemma. But you've got to be thinking about the relation between activities of justifying and the status of being justified, justificatory status, the notorious ing-ed ambiguity. Or for the notion of experience, Sellars thinks that Berkeley's subjective idealism comes from running together the notion of what's experienced and the act of experiencing it. That the form of his master argument really is, well, everything we know by experience. All we know is what's, if we disambiguate it, experienced. So all we know is experience, in the sense of experiencing. All we can know is our acts of experiencing. If he had, in fact, experience was not the term he was bending about here, but Sellars sees Berkeley as going wrong precisely over this ing-ed ambiguity. So he's always going to be very careful about when he's talking about the activity of describing, explaining, justifying, perceiving, inferring. As I say, all these important philosophical concepts come with this double-barreled character, we could say. And when you use a term like description that's ambiguous, you need to be able to say, well, do you mean the describing or the describable when you talk about description? Yeah.
Is it illegitimate to identify the two modes in certain cases? The experienced and the...
Well, I wouldn't be confident making a blanket prohibition of it, it would be a substantive claim. And in thinking about Cartesian self-intimating episodes, for instance, is where one might be tempted to identify them as where representing and represented coincide. If you think of the sort of semantic regress in Descartes, we know things outside the mind by representing them. We have representings of the represented world. Well, how do we know the representings? Well, we know those by having them. If we had to know them by representing them, we'd be off on a semantic regress. So if you were going to think about them sort of representationally, you could say, well, they are representings, but there's another sense in which they're representings and represented at the same time. So that's a tempting possibility under some circumstances, taking on a job of work in asserting that in a particular case. Okay, this ing-ed ambiguity, this comes up early in EPM, so we will see it again. Okay. The remaining of these passages are now sort of spreading out from this base of talk about describing, explaining, justifying. But we saw modal vocabulary, subjunctive conditionals, play a special role with respect to justification, with respect to explanation. How are they related to the space of implications that he was talking about? Okay. Now, in a very interesting document called Autobiographical Reflections, which is available on the website, Sellars talks about the development of his own thought. Starts off with an anecdote of him meeting Carnap, his hero, when Sellars was just a graduate student. But when Sellars is looking back from the 1970s at his early development, it says already when he was at Oxford, so as a graduate student, he had the idea that what was needed was a functional theory of concepts that would make their role in reasoning, rather than their supposed origin and experience, their primary feature. So here I see him as saying, look, there's an empiricist view. You want to understand a concept? Look at how it originates in experience. What were the experiences on which it is based? Sort of weasel word, is that justificatory? Is that causal? Where did it come from? Sellars' hero Kant had objected to Locke, the arch British empiricist, as failing to distinguish between justification and causation, and so providing, as he says, the celebrated Mr. Locke, who provided a mere physiology of the understanding instead of a proper epistemology by only looking at causal antecedents. Sellars is thinking of a sort of empiricist view that wants to know about any concept. How did we get from experience to here? And he's thinking instead of a rationalist alternative that says if you want to understand some concept, think about the role it plays in reasoning. Now here he's saying reasoning, that's the activity. How that's related to the space of implications or the space of reasons that we've heard about, those are relations among something or others, maybe assertables, reasoning something else here. But he already had this idea. Think about role in reasoning instead of origin in experience, and that's going to be one of the clues to how we can get beyond just thinking of descriptive functions of things. Here's another point. Kant, in passage 8, was on the right track when he insisted that just as concepts are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in judgments, so judgments, and therefore indirectly concepts, are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in reasonings or arguments. So Sellars at this point is, in effect, turning that traditional logical order of explanation on its head. The traditional order that started with concepts, understood judgments in terms of them, and then understood syllogisms or consequences, inferences in terms of them. And he's saying, well, you should think about the inferrings and think about the role the judgments play in those in order to understand the judgments. Just as Kant had said, if you want to understand concepts, think about the contribution they make to judgments that they're in. Think of them as functions of judgment. And he's putting this forward as taking another step of the same kind that he sees Kant as having taken from this logical tradition. In a couple minutes, when I talk about Kant, I'll say sort of how I think that move comes up in Kant. Okay, I'm going to be a little bit quicker as we go along these now. 9, we've established not only that subjunctive conditionals are the expressions of material rules of inference, but that the authority of those rules is not derivative from formal rules. In other words, we've shown that material rules of inference are essential to the language we speak, for we make constant use of subjunctive conditionals. It's very tempting to conclude that material rules of inference are essential to languages containing descriptive terms. So that's picking up a couple of the threads from before. Okay. Back to CDCM in 10, the idea that the world can in principle be so described that the description contains no modal expressions, for him the paradigm is always subjunctive conditionals, is of a piece with the idea that the world can in principle be so described that the description contains no prescriptive expressions. Now this statement is characteristically maddening in that he doesn't say in this excerpt or even in the surrounding text, and that's a terrible idea. That box that it belongs in, that's a bad idea. Or, yeah, well, of course, you can describe the world in terms that don't involve prescriptive terms. Of course you can. He doesn't tell us what his attitude towards that box is. He just says that the modal expressions and the normative expressions belong in a box that one could take an attitude about their relation, an attitude towards, about their relation to descriptive vocabulary. I mean, we can see him wrestling with sort of some of the same issues here, and he does have a view, but it's not easy to extract from. Okay, another statement about the relation between these things. Dark and gnomic. The language of modalities is a transposed language of norms. There's some intimate connection he's seeing between the modal sense of must that expresses a lethic necessity and the normative sense of must, you must help her. She needs help, which is not a lethic necessity, but something like deontic obligation. Now, transposed, what is exactly he saying about the relation between these bits of language? I'll mention that Paul Grice's Locke lectures, which were posthumously published as aspects of reason, is at least one of the main themes of that set of lectures, is precisely how lethic modal locutions and deontic normative locutions are two sides of one coin. That there's, the line Grice is elaborating is, there's a core mother notion that gets split into two species, one of which is a lethic modality, the other is a normative notion. And he's after that primordial unified notion before those dimensions of modality, lethic and deontic, have split off from one another. Now, that book is really hard to understand, but I mentioned that as maybe the most prominent version of somebody else who is saying something like this. Is it a confusion? Is it something deep? I'm going to argue that there is a deep insight here. Now, here's an often referred to passage from his earlier work. To say that man is a rational animal is to say that man is a creature not of habits, but of rules. When God created Adam, he whispered in his ear, "In all contexts of action you will recognize rules, if only the rule to grope for rules to recognize. When you cease to recognize rules, you will walk on 4 feet." One of the things Sellars takes over from Kant is a concern with the nature of rulishness and the role of rules. It's from LRB, Language, Rules, and Behavior is the name of the essay. A rule, properly speaking, isn't a rule unless it lives in behavior, rule-regulated behavior, even rule-violating behavior. Linguistically, we always operate within a framework of living rules. To talk about rules is to move outside the talked about rules into another framework of living rules. The snake which sheds one skin lives within another. In attempting to grasp rules as rules from without, we're trying to have our cake and eat it. To describe rules is to describe the skeletons of rules. A rule is lived, not described. This essay, 1954. 14. The means of semantical statements is no more a psychological word than is the ought of ethical statements or the must of modal statements. You get these assimilations. Well, okay, can we say something about what they have in common? Psychology here is a mode of description, a kind of descriptive vocabulary. Okay. I agonized about whether to put 15 in. It doesn't have a lot to do with the other passages, but it epitomizes a really important argument of his from his phenomenalism essay. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a question about 13.
Yeah.
Well, sorry. What does he mean when he say we are trying to have our cake and eat it?
So I mean, the slogan is you can't have your cake and eat it too. You have to choose. Either you keep the cake or you eat it.
I see.
And he's saying you can't be inside the rules and outside talking about them at the same time.
I see. Then is this passage echoing Carnap?
He has Carnap in mind. I mean, I think what he's saying is going substantially beyond that. But we'll see in the early papers that we'll start reading already for next time that he's focusing on the notion of meta-languages, sort of inventing the notion of pragmatic meta-languages, worrying about how they relate to semantic meta-languages and how they relate to sort of living within the rules. Here, if we, well, no, I'm going to go still in order. Okay, so
Can I
this,
ask another question on that
yeah,
same topic?
okay, so,
What's the relationship supposed to be between the modal expressions and the rules? Are those just the same thing, or are those?
I mean, I think it's really complicated. A passage that I didn't put in here, but I could just as easily, from Inference and Meaning, he says, I will be interpreting the modal statement that all A's are necessarily B's as the expression of a rule that we can infer, well, as the expression of a rule. And he unpacks that a little bit to say it's a rule that takes us from A claims to B claims, a rule of inference.
Mm-hmm.
And this is connected to what he means when he says the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. Talk about rules is the way he's talking about
The meaning of
norms.
that phrase just falls apart in my.
Well, because we don't know what
It's
transposed.
abstract, yeah.
We don't know what transposed means, but what I'm saying is, he says, if you want to understand the meaning of the expression necessarily, in all A's are necessarily B's. Remember the passage from Autobiographical Reflections? Think about its role in reasoning. Think about the role that modal expression is playing in reasoning, and he's saying it's something like an inference license. It's licensing you to endorse subjunctive conditionals, to move inferentially, to have a rule that says that if you're justified in calling it an A, you're justified in calling it a B. Now there's a difference of level between the modal claim and this claim about rules. That's what the transposition is talking about. But he's making a deep semantic claim about modal expressions, and the semantic claim is about their relation to rules of inference.
I have a question about 12 and the difference between a habit and a rule. Habits, that immediately evokes Peirce for me. Peirce's whole theory was about how we develop habits and through experience, and that justifies, I guess, it's not Peirce isn't necessarily, it's not a linguistic claim, but it essentially justifies how we respond to the world. Your awareness, I don't know. But how exactly is Sellars differentiating a habit and a rule?
Okay, good question, because he's using it importantly differently than Peirce does. So he means, Sellars means a mere regularity, something we could describe. So, he has the habit of walking through the park on his way back every day. That's attributing a regularity, that's describing what he does. To have that as a rule, that's a different thing that involves being criticizable, being accessible, and so on. Now, Peirce, one of the reasons he liked the notion of rule, the notion of habit, and wanted it to do all this work for him, was he thought that it was implicitly normative already, that this was the form in which norms arose that, there's one place where he observes that the Latin form in which Newton lays down his laws in Principia is the same form that a notice board that would say neckties will be worn in the officer's mess would say. It's what Sellars will call an ought to be, but still something with a substantial normative force of law. And Peirce saw normativity as an emergent property in habits and needed that sort of normativity. When Sellars is using habit, it's not normative, it's a mere regularity. The language rules and behavior and some reflections on language games from 54 to 56 are locus classicus for this, and we'll read both of those. Okay, 15, this is the key claim of his phenomenalism essay, which is actually the latest essay that we'll read of his. To claim that the relationship between the framework of sense contents and that of physical objects can be construed on the phenomenalist model, that is, to think of physical objects as constellations of sense contents, is to commit oneself to the idea that there are inductively confirmable generalizations, subjunctive conditionals, about sense contents, which are in principle capable of being formulated without the use of the language of physical things. This idea is a mistake. I'm not going to say anything more about that, except this is epitomizing a really important argument. Okay, 16. And this is a passage that's near and dear to John McDowell's heart. Anything which can properly be called conceptual thinking can occur only within a framework of conceptual thinking in terms of which it can be criticized, supported, refuted, in short, evaluated. To be able to think is to be able to measure one's thoughts by standards of correctness, of relevance, of evidence. In the space of justification. In this sense, a diversified conceptual framework is a whole which, however sketchy, is prior to its parts, and cannot be construed as a coming together of parts which are already conceptual in character. The conclusion is difficult to avoid that the transition from preconceptual patterns of behavior to conceptual thinking was a holistic one, a jump to a level of awareness which is irreducibly new, a jump which was the coming into being of man. McDowell will cite in this connection the Wittgensteinian image of the light dawning slowly over the whole. But exactly how is this supposed to go? How does the saltation, the jump, happen? That's something that Sellars worries about the sort of mechanisms of a lot more than McDowell does. McDowell says, well, it happened, here we are. Okay, 17, this should sound familiar. To say that a person desired to do A, thought it his duty to do B, but was forced to do C, is not to describe him as one might describe a scientific specimen. One does indeed describe him, but one does something more. And it's this something more which is the irreducible core of the framework of persons. In what does this something more consist? To think of a featherless biped as a person is to think of it as a being with which one is bound up in a network of rights and duties. From this point of view, the irreducibility of the personal is the irreducibility of the ought to the is. But even more basic than this, although ultimately we'll see that the 2 points coincide, is the fact that to think of a featherless biped as a person is to construe its behavior in terms of actual or potential membership in an embracing group, each member of which thinks of itself as a member of the group. Let's call such a group a community. And then, so there's going to be a deep connection between the normative and the social, and the self-conscious sort of thinks of itself as a member of the community, which we might think is connected to that sense in which the conceptual realm is a whole which precedes its parts. Okay. Exemplification is a quasi-semantical relation. He's playing off of Carnap's notion of quasi-syntactical as a way of talking about the metalinguistic. We'll talk about this some more. And it, and universals. So, redness, lionhood, are in the world only in that broad sense in which the world includes linguistic norms and roles viewed from the standpoint of a fellow participant. And he says parenthetically, viewed, thus in translating from the standpoint of a fellow participant. He's got a narrow view of the world. That's the world that science is the measure of all things. And then he's got a broader view of the world that includes sort of lived rules and things that you're only aware of from a participant perspective. Okay. I wanted to rehearse that to give you some sense of the richness of the questions he's asking, of the claims he's making, of the view he's going to have of our activities. Wouldn't you like to really understand everything that he said there? I know I would. I have views about some of it, but when I talk about it, every time one goes back and tries to think about these things again, one discovers more things, more pieces of it, more resonances to it. This is real philosophy that he is doing, and the views are not views that are abroad in the land generally. He's got quite distinctive views here, though they connect to things that other people are doing in interesting ways. And I think it's striking, once again, though there were some little bits of jargon, subjunctive conditionals, and so on, how rich a thematic and sort of problematic area he can delineate while just talking about describing and explaining and rules, and not invoking, not wheeling in heavy philosophically theoretical machinery. Fair warning, he does wheel that stuff in, but it's only after we've got some issues in view that then he wants to sort of sort things out. And again, fair warning, some things I think he really does sort out. A lot of other stuff he doesn't. And most of the stuff he doesn't, he realizes that he doesn't, but he still, as he says, is beating about in the neighboring bushes, even when he can't give us an account here. So it's tantalizing. One learns some things and wants to take the next step, and you can see him wanting to take the next step, and he just doesn't know how to do it. But this just means there's work for us to do too. Okay, why don't we take the break now? Let's take 15 minutes. And when we come back, I'll talk about some of the intellectual historical background in Kant and the Neo-Kantians, and then talk about Sellars and what we're going to read.